Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for your goodness to us. We thank you that we can be here, that you have given us this day, that it is indeed a gift from you. And Lord, I pray that you would help us as we come to consider this fourth word, the word on the Sabbath. Lord, give us wisdom. Help us to come and sit beneath your word. And Lord, I pray that it would be a blessing to us. We ask this in the name of Christ, our Savior. Amen. All right, so 4 words. We are looking at the fourth word of the 10 words, right? These 10 commandments, central ethical teaching of Scripture, and we are on number 4. Number 4. And so let me just read it for us before we jump in. Number 4, which is the Sabbath. And I'm going to read it in 2 different places. So if you remember, the Sabbath, the 10 commandments are found in 2 chapters, the entirety. They're found in Exodus 20 and in Deuteronomy 5. In Exodus 20, it's Israel gathered around Mount Sinai. They're given there. And then Deuteronomy 5, Deuteronomy is Israel on the verge of entering the promised land. So they're reminded of the law before they enter the promised land. So from Exodus, it says this: remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. All right? That's the Exodus commandment. Let me read from Deuteronomy. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy. As the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But on the 7th day is Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your ox or your donkey or any of your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. And you'll notice here some things in yellow. In fact, let me also circle that. Mostly the same. Exodus, Deuteronomy, a few differences. Exodus says, remember the Sabbath. Deuteronomy says, observe the Sabbath. And then those yellow parts in Deuteronomy, I've highlighted as well. Those are not in the Exodus one. But you'll see pretty much the same exact commandment. But if we continue reading, pay attention to the difference. Because then, Exodus and Deuteronomy, we're going to keep reading both of those, they depart. That's our next slide. Exodus continues. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and made it holy. Right? Grounded in creation. If you can read my handwriting at all, probably not. But notice that little word there, for. It's giving the reason. He said, remember the Sabbath, here's the reason. And he grounds it going back to creation, right? Reminding of Genesis 1. Genesis 1 and 2, actually, the first few verses of Genesis 2, which we'll read, conclude the Genesis account in chapter 1. The chapter breaks in your Bibles aren't always right, and I think in Genesis 1, it's actually not right. The account of Genesis 1 proceeds through the first 3 verses of Genesis 2. But it's grounded in creation. Deuteronomy writes this way: you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and with an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. So we have 2 different commands, the same commands, 2 different places, and 2 different reasons. All right, we can actually do some back and forth. Now, if this one's creation, what one word summary could you use for the Deuteronomy reason?
Redemption.
Yeah, there you go. Good. Redemption. So it's given 2 different foundations. If you were to think of it as broadly, it's keep the Sabbath day, the foundations, creation and redemption. This is going to be key as we move. We're going to kind of look at the Old Testament, and then as we move to the New Testament and consider our own practice, I want us to remember these 2 words. But first, let's look at creation. Right? Exodus points us back to creation. It's pointing us back to Genesis 1 and 2 and saying, keep the Sabbath because of what God did. And we see this in Genesis 2, verses 1 to 3. This is these verses. Moses writes, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation." Right? The Sabbath is grounded in creation because it looks back to God's pattern of work and then seventh day rest. More than that, I think theologians rightly have noted that this language of blessing and making it holy, making it set apart, imply that the Sabbath was also for Adam to keep as well. If you ask, well, what does it mean for a day to be set apart for God? What does it mean for God to bless a day and to set it apart? That's language used of God doing it for us, his people, to keep. And so theologians, I think, have rightly seen here a Sabbath Sabbath pattern and imitation, even in the garden before the fall. That Adam, inasmuch as he was the image of God, was still to imitate God. God who had worked and then on the seventh day had rested. You see, Adam wasn't created for an eternity of work. When Adam was created, significantly, he was created outside the garden, from the dust of the ground outside, taken, put in the garden. And then what was Adam tasked to do? He was given some commands. Name the animals. That's very important. So he is like God named things. Let there be light, and then he named day and night. So Adam is already imitating God in the naming of animals. He's operating as God's image bearer, having dominion. Yeah, and what else is after God created Eve? Then what is Adam tasked to do? Be fruitful and multiply. And then let's keep going. And do what? Fill the earth, subdue it, and have dominion over it. Right? In other words, there was a task given to Adam and Eve that could be accomplished. If he had remained faithful, at some point, they would have been fruitful and multiplied, filled the earth with God's image bearers. They would have had dominion over it, and it would have been subdued. The entire earth would have been like that Garden of Eden, that as they cultivated and expanded its borders, there was an end goal. And the Sabbath was to remind Adam and all his progeny, if he had been faithful there, that the end goal was not an eternity of work in this same state, but it was actually the rest that God offered. It was work unto rest. Work unto rest. Meredith Kline, one of my favorite theologians, put it this way. He said, by imprinting the sabbatical pattern on man's days, God was promising nothing less than that he would bring his human image bearer to participate in the royal rest of his own Sabbath day. The Sabbath ordinance conveyed a divine commitment to consummate man's beatitude. Right? So the Sabbath was for Adam a reminder that God would one day consummate his happiness in a full and final participation in glory of that eternal rest. So it was a sign for Adam, even in creation, even before the fall, before sin had entered into the world. There was this pattern, not only for God, but also for God's image bearers who are to imitate him of work and then rest. And we also see this pattern hinted at in a text we've already looked at today, Exodus 16. So, I just said it. The 10 Commandments are given in Deuteronomy 5, but Exodus 20. Exodus 20. So, basic math, 16 becomes before 20. Exodus 16 is before the 10 Commandments are given. Before the 10 Commandments, what do we see in Exodus 16? We see talk of the Sabbath. We didn't read these verses, but Exodus 16:23 says this. This is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. And then 29, see, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the sixth day, he gives you bread for 2 days. Remain each of you in his place. Let no one go out of his place on the seventh day. All right? So God, even before the law, before the Mosaic covenant and the law were made and the law was given on Mount Sinai, the Sabbath was there. Which gives us a hint to the fact that just like we see it in creation, the Sabbath, though it will be tied particularly to this divine covenant given on Mount Sinai and the law, is a broader reality than that because it predates it. it back in creation, and it predates it even in Exodus chapter 16. And just note here as well, we're going to emphasize this later on, but the context, remember, this is manna, bread from heaven. And what specifically does God tell his people not to do? Right? He's giving them bread. And he says on the sixth day, he'll give you bread for 2 days, which means on the Sabbath day, you don't go out and collect any bread. So what do you have to do to keep the Sabbath? You have to trust that God will give you enough on the day before so that you don't have to go out and provide for yourself the next day. Right? The Sabbath was training God's people to trust in him to provide and not to go out and try to provide for themselves on that day. So the Sabbath is a creation ordinance. It predates the giving of the law, and it teaches God's people to trust in him. And let's go on. We've got a lot to get through, and we started late. We're already coming up on 11:30, but we'll probably go a little bit late as well. So Sabbath, a creation ordinance, but it is particularly tied to the old covenant. We're going to see that in the next slide. Exodus 31:13 says this, above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths. And notice there the plural. Okay, that's significant. Keep my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you throughout all your generations, that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you. Okay, here we see that the Sabbath was, for the people of Israel, one of the signs of the old covenant. Right? Together with the Passover, these are the signs that God gave his people of that particular covenant. And remember, this is what God does every time he makes a covenant. When God made the covenant with Noah, right, this is the easy one, right? What sign did he give him? In the sky. You can say it, a rainbow. There you go. God gave a sign of covenant. It was the rainbow. When God made his covenant with Abraham, what was the sign he gave of that covenant? If you didn't want to say rainbow, circumcision. That's the sign he gave. He gives a sign. All right, in the New Testament, the new covenant, what are the signs, plural, of the new covenant? There's two. The first is baptism. The second, communion, the Lord's Supper. That's right. These are signs of covenants. He says the Sabbath is a sign of the old covenant. And notice the plural, that it's part of this system of sabbatical years, which ultimately culminated in the Jubilee year. So not only was Israel supposed to rest on the seventh day, but the seventh year was a Sabbath year where they didn't plant their fields. They let the land rest. And on the 50th year, which is kind of like the 7 sevens, the 50th year culminates that pattern, was a Jubilee year. Debts were forgiven, slaves were freed, and it was a kind of extra Sabbath. So it became a sign of the old covenant. But if we keep reading throughout the Old Testament, the Sabbath, it starts out in creation. It's given us a sign of this covenant, but then it actually becomes a sign of God's people's failure. We're not going to read the whole chapter, but in Ezekiel 20, it's a good one to read. In Ezekiel 20, Ezekiel comes to God's people and he lays out for them, this is why God is kicking you out of the land. And you know what he repeats over and over and over again? I just have a few of them there. This is Ezekiel 20. Look what he says over and over again. And my Sabbaths they greatly profaned, and profaned my Sabbaths. They profaned my Sabbaths, profaned my Sabbaths. 4 times in that chapter, he mentions again and again that they did not keep the Sabbath. It was a sign of Israel's failure. And we read this in 2 Chronicles as well. We're moving. In 2 Chronicles 36, 20, and 21, this is the narrative of the exile. And actually, in the Hebrew Bible, 2 Chronicles is the last book of the Bible. So this is right at the tail end of the Hebrew Bible, your Old Testaments. It says this, and he took into exile in Babylon those who had escaped from the sword, right, that's Nebuchadnezzar, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days that it lay desolate, it kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. So, the reason the exile happened, one of the reasons was Israel had not kept God's Sabbaths. And then the reason it happened for the length of time that it did, 70 years, was so that the land would have the rest it should have had their entire history there, that they did not give it. It was that 7 years was tied to their failure to keep the Sabbath as a sign of that covenant. All right, that's our Old Testament. Let me sum up the Old Testament. First, the pattern is 6 days of work, then 1 day of rest. There's a work, then rest pattern. Second, it is grounded, and here we're going to just emphasize this again, in creation and redemption. It is grounded in the fact that God worked and then rested, and it's grounded in the fact that then when they were brought up out of Egypt, it wasn't by their own might. It wasn't by their own effort. It wasn't because they defeated the Pharaoh's armies and had a slave revolt and fought their way out. No, it was God who did everything, and they just walked as they followed the pillar. And the Sabbath teaches trust. When we rest, when Israel rested, they weren't providing for themselves. All right, and now think about this. In the wilderness, if there's any circumstance in your life in which you probably have pressure to make sure you're providing for yourself, it's probably when you're living in tents off the land in a sparse place, right? All of us have homes that we live in. We probably have refrigerators, pantries full of food. And I only go grocery shopping once a week, and we have enough. And we have freezers in the basement that have even more food. We could probably go for quite a while without even going out to get more food. But imagine you're living and you have none of that. You're in tents in the desert. There's going to be a lot of pressure to make sure you have enough every single day. The Sabbath was to teach them to trust in God, that God would provide. It was to remind them that their salvation was of God. We saw that the Sabbath is a creation ordinance and a sign of the old covenant. So it's a sign of this particular covenant that God gave, but it's also a part of a bigger reality that goes back to creation. And then last, Israel went into exile for profaning the Sabbath. It was so key that when God took them out of the land and the final covenant curses came down upon them, what God told them again and again was, it was because you did not keep my Sabbaths. You did not let the land rest. Okay, so that's the Old Testament overview. Let's turn our attention to the New Testament. And in between the Old and the New Testament is really the ministry of Jesus. So Jesus was ministering after the Old Testament was written, but before the New Testament was written. In fact, that he was the one that came to make that new covenant, that New Testament. And so he's the hinge, obviously, right, of everything. The reason the New Testament exists is because of Jesus and what he did. And this is what Jesus said on the Sabbath. 2 passages from Mark. In the end of 2 and the beginning of 3, Jesus speaks to the Sabbath. And in the end of Mark chapter 2, Jesus says, again, this is to opponents who are saying, look, your disciples are working on the Sabbath. They're gleaning grain from the fields on the Sabbath to eat as they walk through. Jesus says this to them. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. All right, he is stating that the Sabbath was made with a purpose, and it was to serve man. It wasn't the other way around. It wasn't that man was made for the Sabbath was made for man, and he is asserting his own lordship over it. Mark 3:4, again, this is engaging with, again, his opponents. Now, with regard to a man whom he's going to heal on the Sabbath, Jesus asks this to them. He says, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill? And they were silent. They couldn't answer. We could look a lot more at those texts. In fact, when I preached through this, I think I did 3 whole sermons just on these texts and the Sabbath in general in Mark. So you could go back and listen to those if you really wanted to. But here's the point. When confronted with the Pharisees and his opponents, Jesus is going to reject their legalism. Their legalistic interpretation of the Sabbath said, you can't heal on the Sabbath, that's work. You can't pick heads of grain as you walk along the field to eat. That's like harvesting, that's work. Jesus is going to reject their legalism. He's going to affirm the goodness of the Sabbath and say it was given as a gift and a blessing for man. And he is going to say, I am Lord over it. I am the Lord over it. Which, if the Sabbath goes all the way back to creation, and Jesus is saying, I am Lord over that. All right, here's a not so veiled to the Jewish leaders affirmation of his own divinity. There's no one else. No one, not Moses, not David, not Ezekiel or Isaiah or anyone else in the Bible that you could say would be Lord of the Sabbath, except for God himself. So we see Jesus affirming the goodness of the Sabbath, his lordship, rejecting legalism. And then as we keep reading on in the New Testament, we see this transition from the seventh day to the first day. And that's what we see here. We see at the end of the Gospels that Christ was raised on the first day of the week. We see that in all the Gospels. We see that the church met on the first day of the week. We see that in Acts and in 1 Corinthians. And we have this reference in the book of Revelation to the Lord's Day. The Lord's Day, which most interpreters take to be Sunday. Because if you're asked, well, what day belongs to Christ in a unique way, such that you can call it the Lord's Day, just like we call this the Lord's Supper, no other day seems to make sense except for Sunday, the day he rose from the dead. So we're going to get to a connection between the first day and the seventh day in just a bit. But we're going to keep moving here. I'm going to blow through some of this. But in our New Testament, we also see that the Sabbath, as a sign of the Old Covenant, has indeed ended. I'll just read the left-hand side, Colossians, but Romans says something very similar. Colossians 2:16 and 17, Paul writes to the church there, and he says this, "Let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath. These are shadows of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ." All right, all of these things, food and drink, think of the clean and unclean laws, what you could and couldn't eat or drink. The festivals, think about those festivals of the Old Testament, the festival of booths and of trumpets, these annual festivals that Israel had to participate in. Their new moons, which were also tied to their worship and celebration, and their Sabbaths. Right? These things, he says, he's putting it all together, talking about this system of ceremonial worship, saying all of that was a shadow, but the substance belongs to Christ. The substance belongs to Christ. These are speaking of the Old Covenant, and so they're saying the Old Covenant, inasmuch as it has gone away and been replaced by the New Covenant, so the sign of the Old Covenant goes with it and is replaced by what? Well, here's where I want us to turn our attention. I know we're going quick, and I wish I had a handout for you, but I'm recording it, so it'll be online. Wish I had a handout for you, but let me turn our attention quickly to Hebrews chapter 4. Hebrews chapter 4 is essentially the book of Hebrews is expounding upon Psalm 95. But look at what the author of Hebrews, whom I think is Paul, said concerning the Sabbath. He says this, "If Joshua had given them rest, he would not have spoken of another day after that." So what he's saying here is we have this promise of rest in the Psalms long after Joshua and the conquest. If the rest that the Sabbath pointed to was totally fulfilled by them coming into the promised land and each sitting under their own vine and having the land that flows with milk and honey, if that was the end of it, then you wouldn't have any talk about, yep, you got the fulfillment. But he's saying, if you keep reading your Old Testament, you see the promise of another day. You see a future promise much later than Joshua. He says that, "So there remains," present tense, "a Sabbath rest for the people of God." And then look at verse 10. "For the one," and here I do think he's speaking of Jesus. Our translations aren't great here. I don't think it's for whoever. It's for the one who has entered his rest, has himself also rested from his works, as God did from his. Okay, do you see what he's doing? He's saying there remains a Sabbath rest, and why? That rest is grounded in Christ, who, just like God, worked in creation and then rested, kind of sat down on his throne as the one who had made all things to rest. So Christ worked, performed his work, and then, upon his resurrection, has rested from his works. He never needs to die again. He does not need to go to the cross again. He has rested. Hebrews often speaks about Christ as seated at the right hand of the Majesty on high. And then says this, "Therefore," again, another key word, "let us be diligent to enter that rest, so that no one will fall through following the same example of disobedience." Here's what I think the author of Hebrews is getting on here. He's saying the Old Testament Sabbath was not final. even when they came into the land. And the book of Joshua is about as good as it gets in the Old Testament, because from there you get Judges, which is a downward spiral, and then the kings are just pretty much terrible, and ultimately you end in exile, right? So you start well in Joshua. Joshua is a godly leader. The people are by and large faithful, but he's saying that wasn't it. They didn't fulfill, they didn't experience the final Sabbath. Then the Old Testament Sabbath was not final. He says that a Sabbath rest remains for God's people today, even in the New Testament. And that rest is grounded in the work and the rest of Christ, that work and rest of Christ, and that there is a final rest still in the future. That is what he's talking about here, that rest. There's a final rest still in the future. So, how can we compare the Old Testament Sabbath and the New Testament Lord's Day? Here's a summary. The Old Testament Sabbath is grounded in creation. The Lord's Day, which I think is that there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God, it's speaking of the Lord's Day there, is grounded in the new creation. The Old Testament Sabbath was grounded in redemption from Egypt. The New Testament Lord's Day is grounded in redemption from sin. The Old Testament Sabbath, the pattern was work and then rest. That your works, kind of where you were working your way, and then you got to enter rest as a kind of culmination of your work. The New Testament pattern flips it upside down and says, no, the rest comes first. You rest on the first day, and then you work. It is significant that we number our days beginning on Sunday. The New Testament does that, because the pattern is not work, and then you get to rest on Sunday. No, the pattern is you get to rest on Sunday, and then you go out from that rest to work. That's why we have the change from the seventh day to the first day. I have a quote here I forgot from the last slide. This is, he was one of my professors, one of my favorite theologians. If you ever get to read anything by this man, it is gold. G.K. Beale. He says this. He said, if the eschatological, by that he means kind of final and ultimate reality of the final Sabbath rest has not consummately come, then it is unlikely that the typological sign pointing to that ultimate rest has ceased. What he's saying is, if we haven't yet got that reality towards which the Sabbath pointed, if that reality remains in the future, it makes sense that the sign pointing to it would remain in some sense. And so I do think that we should understand the Lord's Day, the first day of the week, as the New Testament fulfillment in some partial way of the Sabbath. In the same way that the Lord's Supper corresponds to the Passover meal, but is not identical with, so too the Lord's Day in the New Testament corresponds to, but it's not identical with, the Old Testament Sabbath. And principally, the pattern is different. Now we rest first because that work has already been done by Christ. And then out of that, we follow him in obedience. So I know we are running through this, but I want us to have some time for discussion. Let me kind of give an overview of takeaways. First, you might not be convinced by what I'm saying. What I'm arguing is we should keep the Lord's Day as a sort of New Testament Sabbath. Even if you're not convinced, consider these things. The Sabbath was made to be a blessing to man, not a burden. Jesus says it was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. It was made to be a blessing, not a burden. It was one of God's gifts. It was a good thing for his people. Consider also that the final reality towards which it has pointed throughout all of history, from beginning with Adam, even until now, that final reality yet is in the future. When Christ returns and makes all things new, when we are raised to be with him forever, we're not going to have the pattern of rest and then work, or work and then rest. We are going to enter into that rest, and it will be rest and rest and rest and rest forevermore. In that way, the Lord's Day should be a foretaste of eternity. It should be a foretaste of eternity. And so one of the ways, I was just speaking with someone this week about, how should you keep the Lord's Day? What would that look like? Here's my suggestion. Do on the Lord's Day what we're going to be doing forever. What are we going to do forever? Well, we're going to worship. We're going to worship God. What are we going to do? We're going to fellowship with the saints. right? Whenever you read the visions of heaven and the new creation, the vision is not just kind of you by yourself and God. It is the whole multitude that cannot be numbered gathered together. We're going to have fellowship with the saints, and we are going to have rest. We will lay down our labors. We will no longer need to build and to fight. We won't be the church militant. We'll be the church triumphant at rest. And then last, keep the Lord's Day as a way of trusting in God, as a way of remembering that God has promised to provide. And so you don't need to go Sunday as soon as we get home. All right, I've got to go get back to the grind. Get back to the grind because, God's not going to provide for me. I got to provide for myself. Actually, stepping back and resting is a very practical way of making yourself and training yourself to trust in God. Because when you're resting, guess what you're not doing? You're not earning money. You're not providing for yourself. You're not fixing up that thing that needs to be fixed. You're not going out to do your side hustle and make that extra money. No, you're saying, I'm going to rest and trust in God to provide.